Yeah, House of the Dragon episode 2 is pretty freaking great. I was a little hesitant on the first episode about the show being as good as the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones, but episode 2 really blew me away. Besides the best scenes within the episode that I'll get to later, I think the direction of this episode was masterfully done in respect to acting, cinematography, pacing, and editing. Firstly, let's talk about the acting, because holy shit, the actresses who played Rhaenyra and Alicent spoke volumes with their performances in this episode. This also ties into the pacing of the dialogue scenes, but there were so many slow moments that allowed the camera to sit on a character's face that let us see the subtleties of their performance. It really emphasized what the characters were going through in each moment, and the fact that each shot lingered on the actors and allowed them to wow us with their performance made me gush with joy. Like the scene where Rhaenyra and Alicent are talking to each other by candlelight about their mother and father is a great example of this. There's an entire uninterrupted moment where Rhaenyra is praying and it's just breathtaking. From her acting as she breaks down and the music slowly fading in with a serene and happy tone uplifts the seemingly normal moment to being great. And this isn't even mentioning the gorgeous cinematography. It's genius to me that this scene was filmed next to dozens of candlelights that illuminated the actors' faces. Like you see the specular highlights within each of their eyes as they're on the verge of crying. So even the cinematography is elevating the already great performances. And this is just a normal chill scene that doesn't even have major plot significance that fundamentally raises its quality. Because the plot point of Viserys having to find a new match to marry further increased the intrigue value of this episode. This plot development basically twisted a knife into every character and was such an engaging conflict because everyone had a stake in it. Will Corlys Velaryon successfully marry off his daughter, or will other vultures swoop in and take the prize? The point of manipulation as everyone is trying to persuade the king into their own favor is like peak political drama. Viserys being kind of a pushover and a king that can be manipulated makes for a perfect subject in this regard. It really shows and puts a spotlight onto each character's motivations and how grimy and slimy they all are. This was essentially what I love so much about Game of Thrones. So many of those small council meetings that showcase the colorful roster of characters and their varied and dangerous motivations really made everyone fun to watch. House of the Dragon is getting to this point with Otto Hightower and Corlys Velaryon, and there is still some time for the other characters on the small council that haven't been developed as much. But to me, this conflict of finding a spouse is also a perfect formula for creating great dialogue scenes because it's insanely layered. On one hand, we have the conundrum of Viserys not wanting to move on. Then there's the dynamic of Rhaenyra having to accept the obligation that her father has to remarry for legacy. And then finally, we have everyone making a play to seize the opportunity of power. It's just outstanding and it pushes every character to a breaking point this episode. And even characters like Lionel Strong got an opportunity to shine with his own perspective. But it would have been nice if the writers were able to write in a way to tell us the significance of this character and a little bit of his backstory. Because we still don't really know who he is yet. As a point of comparison, Corlys Velaryon had a great monologue that thoroughly built him up as a character by him diving into his backstory. But the genius thing about this scene was that this monologue was doubled as plot development. Slight spoiler, and I'll start to mark any spoilers with time codes just in case anyone hasn't seen the episode, but Corlys Velaryon relating himself to Daemon through his backstory and his overarching pitch to form an alliance with him genuinely impressed me. Because it's really hard to work in a lot of expository backstory and have it make sense within a scene as natural dialogue. But this instance is a shining example of it working, and because of that fact, this was one of my favorite scenes in the episode. And on the subject of best scenes, we have the confrontation of Daemon Targaryen. Now, this is probably a favorite scene among everyone for this episode, and rightfully so because this scene was essentially a masterclass in suspense and tension. Firstly, the music in this scene perfectly aided the rising heat and put everyone on edge. Although Ramin Djawadi didn't make a new theme for the title sequence, which in of itself was really sad and disappointing, he still created great music to drastically rise the tension here. I even loved the subtle editing move in which the music for the confrontation scene begins during Otto Hightower preparing for the trip, and then we cut to Dragonstone. It really eases us into the scene, and it also does away with the notion of fast traveling that was an issue in Game of Thrones, because here in House of the Dragon, it feels like an extension of the same scene. And on that notion, the show is establishing a lot of time jumps, but the narrative still feels very seamless, so the time jumps don't feel jarring in any way. Getting back to the confrontation scene though, the cinematography and overall design of this scene was also intentionally orchestrated to further punch up the suspense. The thick fog rolling over the characters and making everything feel moody is really smart, especially since this was shot on the volume. And if anyone doesn't know what the volume is, it's a massive room with LED panels that essentially work as real-time green screens that play footage on the backgrounds. Within the volume, a small limitation is that you can't really copy direct sunlight that well because it's hard to match the severe output of light from the sun. So the creators decided to set the scene in a thick fog. So this limitation of the volume ended up actually aiding the scene. Then going back to the aspect of the pacing for a scene, the shots where we sit on Otto Hightower's face and the overall arsenal of reaction shots from everyone made me feel even more uneasy. Especially when the dragons start to come out, because man, do the actors illustrate how scared they really are. And the reveal of Caraxes was so good, and I love that we first hear his squeal before his visual introduction. It really emphasizes that oh shit, this is about to get really ugly, and the shot of Otto Hightower soiling himself is the cherry on top. Again, going into minor spoilers, the turn of the scene in which Rhaenyra shows up was a great way to have her gain some value and clout, and prove to people that she's really smart and brave. Her dynamic with Daemon is really refreshing, and I like how they don't just simply hate each other. Something that I was kind of worried about in episode 1 where Daemon might turn into a generic villain, but that worry has completely vanished. In this scene, we also hear Rhaenyra's new theme, and I love how they introduce it here, because this was essentially the first time she proves herself, so she's basically earning her theme through this event. Because of this, that even makes her more of a badass as she's proudly walking through the Red Keep with her new theme playing aloud. And yet again, this also deletes my other worry that Ramin Djawadi would use a Frankenstein version of Daenerys' theme for Rhaenyra. So thank God there's a new theme for her to differentiate her a bit more. Another aspect this episode does really well is the political intrigue. That was one major aspect that Game of Thrones did perfectly, so it's really assuring to see House of the Dragon handle the political sphere of Westeros just as well. All of the small council meetings are like crack to me because not only do these scenes set up characters in the plot, but they also heavily develop the world and general politics associated with the characters. The show feels very immersive in this regard, and it makes every development that's revealed very engaging because I just want to know more. And I love that they are putting emphasis on the crab feeder conflict because this is something that's impacting very specific parts of the world like trading routes, which normally you wouldn't really hear that much about, but having this detail within the world makes it have even more depth. Which, on the subject of the crab feeder, every shot so far on the beach was beautiful. The shallow focus of crabs walking around feasting on people is such a unique sight to see that it makes what is probably a brief secondary antagonist as being very memorable. That and the design of the crab feeder is very cool, and I'm excited to see what happens with him in the next episode. And since there will be more action in episode 3 due to the preview, it's really nice to know that the dialogue was able to hold up on its own. Because going into House of the Dragon, I thought there would be a bit of an over-reliance on action and dragon spectacle, which thankfully that isn't the case, as evidenced by episode 2, which virtually had no action and instead had insane tension-inducing scenes that were primarily driven by dialogue. So the fact that House of the Dragon has proven to have great dialogue scenes makes me really excited to see how the action portion of the show plays out. Like, to me, this is the best case scenario for how the show could have turned out in my mind. I'm genuinely, at least for episode 2, struggling to find any major flaws. Even the kid actor who plays Laena Velaryon did a surprisingly good job with what she had to do and perfectly illustrated the doubt and hesitation behind what she had to say to Viserys. So for this episode, I'm sitting at about a 9 from how amazing the acting, cinematography, and overall writing was. I feel like I'm fully back into the world of Game of Thrones, and I hope the rest of the season can retain the current quality set by this episode. Thank you for watching, and let me know what you guys thought about episode 2 of House of the Dragon.